I think the beauty of this collection is we also try to expand just a little tiny bit. And if you have an opportunity, I hope you will look at Anna and Natalie, which is actually about children with disabilities and limitations, and it's told in such a wonderful way that you don't even know it. And then the pirate in the kindergarten, about a child who actually has double vision, and that's autobiographical. And then some of our books, like the National Geographic One World, One Day, that takes us through the life of children across the world. And then what Christopher did in Wings is he takes the story of Icarus, who tries to fly too close to the sun, remember, and has the hubris and gets kind of shot down, and he gives it a different twist. And then the Boy Called Slow, what an irony. That's actually the story of Sitting Bull. I'm very pleased with our collection, so proud of it. Now, what would y'all like to say to each other about what you've been talking about?
Actually, I had one quick comment I wanted to make, and in line with what Christopher is saying, the fact that we recognize that there are roots and branches and they're all connected together. I think one of the big problems we have in American culture is we think we can deal with the problem by focusing on it briefly. We can have Black History Month and we can just forget about it for the rest of the time. We can think about Indians around Thanksgiving, thank you for the turkey, and then, well, forget about them. And the thing is, these are good events, but they should not be the be-all and the end-all. They should be, let's call attention so we'll remember through the rest of the year what we're talking about. Because we're not going to look at literature in isolation. One of the things I learned in college and even in high school is that when you dissect a frog, you got a dead frog. And you cut all those parts, the frog's dead, you know. So when you start cutting it up too much, you kill it. It has to be seen as a living, breathing entity. In our culture, you know, multiculturalism is different for each of us. That point is so great. For you, multiculturalism was Western literature. Yeah. That was multicultural. And multiculturalism is everything. It is all inclusive. It's not just these little pigeonholes that have been created to name a group of people and basically to name them out of relevance, to make them irrelevant by classifying them.
And you know, technology, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, well, you can ban a book, but people can find it on the web. And people can, you know, when I was growing up, there were also, I mean, I was born in '63, so it's, you know, in 1970 I was 7. And I came across a book called And Now and Again. And it was the first time I'd ever read a book that talked about Hispanic culture. And I remember thinking then that, like, oh, I am special. Like, look, they're eating beans and tortillas. and it's cool. You know, somehow finding yourself in a book helps you to realize how wonderful your culture is. And I think that...
Affirmation.
It's affirmation.
I did have an old boy who read On the Road, you know, Jack Kerouac in sophomore lit, and guess what? He went on the road and his mom called me and said, well, there you go. So let's take about 5 minutes.
I'd like to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like to just make one comment, or 3 basically. The first one is about our construction of the child. I think that another kind of thread that's going through all of the pushback that we hear is the idea of what is a child. And we talk about, well, has childhood changed? And clearly there's all kinds of access to technology and this sort of thing. But I think that just as much as childhood has changed and developed, our idea of what a child is seems to be getting more and more stultified. Seems to be getting more, I'm getting all kinds of pushback from my editors and from librarians about what a child is in their mind. What a child should be open to. I mean, as a kid, I was surrounded by books. I was lucky enough to be surrounded by books. and picked up everything I possibly could.
Yep.
I loved Greek and Roman myths, probably because of the death and the lurid. There's like a lot of transformation and a lot of dead people. That's just people dying in crazy ways, you know. Turn into a bird, and then the blood hit the ground and became the hyacinth. And then you look at the hyacinth, and you're like, wow, I did not know what a hyacinth was as a flower, but I did know that that was Apollo's friend, you know. So this idea of this understanding what a child is, and we don't want to close the doors of that definition. We don't want to, children are made of possibility. We want to leave those possibilities open. And more and more and more, especially from certain quarters, I'm hearing, well, children don't need this. They should not have this kind of discussion. The scary part of this, of course, is they are exposed to infinitely more nowadays.
Yes, they are.
And they don't have the frameworks with which to understand that exposure. So if you say, I'm going to do a book that includes death, you know, and people will say children should not be exposed to death. They are exposed to death.
Of course they are.
And earlier we had discussions with them about what death looked like. How do you deal with death? But now we're going to shield them from that in their literature. That is something we refuse them the frameworks with which to understand these things. I think that definition of the child is one thing I was thinking about. The other thing, we talked about censorship, and that's another thing that's kind of underlying our discussion. I spend a lot of the time in my life running around the world because you can, and that's nice. And I've dealt with the censors in the last 3 years in China, in Vietnam, in Sudan, and I've dealt with this issue of censorship in a very direct way. You know, if you mount a show, an art show in Vietnam, you first write a letter to the cultural police to tell them what you're trying to do. And I think that our understanding of what censorship is here, just because we do need to eat still, at least I do. You know, and that's something to understand, is that your support is so key to being able to do what we do. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Moby Dick, because you mentioned it.
I like Moby Dick, I don't get it.
I will tell you, I do not like that book. It's got way too much whaling terminology. I don't know anything about whaling. Similar to the way I don't know what hyacinth looks like. If someone could show me, I would appreciate that. But one of the things, again, you talk about these classics, and you talk about a figure like Queequeg, and this multicultural thread, it lives in our literature. It's already been there. You got Queequeg, you've got all these folks that, you know, Toni Morrison talks in her lecture, Playing in the Dark. That, you know, this is our shadow history, and it's our job to take that history out from the shadows. Be it to tell the story of, you know, young women in the Triangle shirt factory, or all the factory working women in the world, or to tell the story of little boys I know from Brooklyn who happen to have wings.
There you go.
I don't actually.
I was going to address something regarding the classics. What I really dislike about arguments that are made is that it's always either or. And we never, and another pet peeve of mine is that people are ahistorical. And they don't know that what we consider to be American classics were not considered to be American classics prior to World War II. That if you were to be an educated person in this country, first of all, you had to read Latin and Greek and French, because that's what the literatures were written in, that's what your academic training would have been, and that it was only a very small percentage of people who would have been able to do that. But there was a democratization of American literature occurring after the World Wars, when we began to look inward to say, we have a voice. There are writers within our midst. And I'm not talking about African American writers or Latino writers. I'm talking about these are people who were, for the most part, white writers who were not a part of the classic canon then. But now they are. Because of that inward turn, that rejection of Europe as the sole model for what we should
Yes.
know. Each year, I start all of my undergraduate classes with reading the classics. And I give them a survey, and it's based upon one of our former education secretaries, William Bennett. Now, I like William Bennett for a variety of reasons, because he did something that was very smart. He took materials that were in the public domain and wrote
Yes.
these books,
That's
the Book
right.
of Virtues and things of that
Yep.
sort. And it reflects the kind of literature to which kids were exposed. But he also created a list in response to what E.B. Hirsch did in terms of cultural literacy.
Right.
And we used to know that he could not have created that list for himself. He had to have some help from some librarians because it was multicultural. But
Yeah.
I always do the traditional classics, as you say, because canons are not dead. They are living. And that there are going to be new works that challenge canonical works, new works brought into the canons. It is an organic process. But with these students, initially when I started doing this about 20-odd years ago, I would list about 50 children's classics in the canon. Treasure Island, Swiss Family Robinson, things of that sort. And I would say, which have you read, which have you not? And typically, the only people who have read more than one or two books, and the most I've ever had anyone read was about 25. She was the daughter of professors, and she had a library of the classics. English majors and people who had families that had a collection of the classics with them. But over the years, those columns have expanded to, I've seen the film. I've seen a condensed graphic, a comic book, or a
Yep.
condensed version, or a novel. Or I've seen some kind of dramatic rendition, or I've heard of it, but I have not read it. And this year when we did it, of the 60-plus undergraduates that I had, the average number of books on that about 50 list was about 3 that they had read.
Yeah.
And so it's not as if multicultural literature had replaced.
It's like literature has been replaced.
This has been replaced, and they aren't reading that either. So I make that point to argue is that the canons have always been the province of an elite portion of the population. The majority of the population, we were surveying you, what you're reading now. How many of you are reading John Grisham or whatever's on top of the best New York Times bestseller list? And probably 8 out of 10 of the top books on the New York Times sellers list are considered pulp fiction or popular fiction, not literature with a capital L, and certainly not the classics. And so when we place the classics on this pedestal, we need to understand why they're placed on that. It's not usually a democratizing act. It's usually an act to limit access. When we say that when your father was named and the article appeared in the New York Times, my classes wrote papers on that. Why are they reading Walter B. Myers and not Sophocles?
Yes.
Right.
These kids in Harlem read Sophocles. Well, that's debatable. But to always make that argument that if we give kids multicultural literature, then they will never pick up these books. You can't understand Toni Morrison unless you
No doubt.
know classic literature.
That's right.
If you want to know why you're struggling with Song of Solomon, it's because of all the references that she makes
Yes.
in Song of Solomon that are
That's right.
related to classic literature. And also her style of writing draws from, somewhat admitted to the canon later, I was going to say Steinbeck, but not Steinbeck. Absalom.
Faulkner.
Faulkner.
William
Thank you.
Faulkner.
Thank you. It will come to my head. That her thesis, if I recall correctly, was on Faulkner. She was very strongly influenced by his writing style, the stream of consciousness, in those books. So in order to understand her at multiple levels, you need to have that background. It's the same thing with what Miles Davis says.
Oh.
If you're going to improvise, you need to know
What you're
standard
improvising
forms,
against.
and you need to know how to break those traditions. So you need to know those traditions. And the same thing with literature. Most of the writers that we place on this list are those who have steeped themselves in other literature, in the literature that we label canonical literature. But they have chosen to break those rules and break those traditions in different ways.